Building on our earlier conversation, we will look today at one particular clip. And very much like our method identified earlier, we will closely pay attention to the construction of this clip, looking at what is present, what is not present, what is foregrounded and what is backgrounded. In this particular story that we will observe, we will pay attention to Wolf Blitzer of CNN going into one of the tunnels dug by Hamas in Gaza and try to understand the way in which this narrative is constructed. First, we begin the story by looking at Blitzer taking us into a tunnel and giving us a view of the tunnel.
This is priority number one for the Israel Defense Forces, finding and destroying dozens of Hamas tunnels.
Let's pay attention. This is priority number one for the Israel Defense Forces, finding and destroying tunnels dug by Hamas. In this particular narrative, Blitzer becomes synonymous with the narrative of the Israel Defense Forces. The standpoint from which the story gets articulated is the standpoint of the Israel Defense Forces, as if Blitzer is a spokesperson of the Israel Defense Forces. From that vantage point then, he gives us a view into the tunnels that serve as threat to Israel. So within this logic also, a frame that gets pushed through is the frame of the tunnels being the threat to Israel and therefore being the legitimate reason for the attacks.
Underground escape hatches from Gaza used to infiltrate Israel and launch attacks.
The narrative then takes us to imagery of Hamas militants, clearly dressed as militants, who are using these tunnels to infiltrate into Israel. What is unclear in this particular imagery is the source of the imagery. Is Blitzer directly filming these pieces of evidence that are being shipped into this story as demonstrations of evidence of Hamas militants getting into Israel? And moreover, there is an implicit connection then that these Hamas militants getting into Israel are the cause for the Israel defense attacks, which is a defensive strategy.
I went to the front line near the Gaza border to see one of those tunnels with IDF Lieutenant Colonel Oshik Azulai.
Particularly worth interrogating is the person that Blitzer goes into the site with. Who is the source of the story and what is his relationship to this particular source? And it becomes pretty difficult to differentiate between Blitzer, the journalist, vis-a-vis Blitzer, the spokesperson for IDF. The story gets narrated as Blitzer goes with an IDF military person into the tunnel. In that sense, once again, he gives us the vantage point as the vantage point of the IDF going into the tunnel. There are no opportunities for critical interrogation of this particular story, but rather the story turns into a frame for narrating the frame through which the IDF wants us to see the world.
Israeli forces have uncovered more than 30 tunnels in this area. All right, let's go in. This tunnel is just under 2 miles long and about 45 feet below ground.
Blitzer talks about the number of tunnels that the Israeli forces have discovered and then gives us the view into one of these tunnels. Once again, this very much looks like a video news release for the Israeli Defense Forces, trying to articulate from the vantage point of the Israeli Defense Forces the kinds of discoveries they have made in terms of the security threats to Israel. When you look at this story and think about what is foregrounded and what is backgrounded, you might ask the question, where is the other voice? Where is the voice of Hamas? Or where are the voices of Palestinians in this particular story? When we talk about balance as a news value that is often circulated in dominant stories in the mainstream, where is the balance? What is the counterpoint to this particular narrative and what would that counterpoint look like? More importantly, in terms of selection of sources, you might ask the question, what does it mean when Blitzer takes it for granted as IDF and Israel being the sources for narrating this particular story, and the findings that therefore emerge within the story.
It begins in the southern Gazan city of Khan Yunis and ends here, near an Israeli kibbutz along the border with Gaza.
You look at the deployment of maps in this particular narrative. So the map is deployed to enact and to reproduce the narrative that is circulated by Israel, which is that these tunnels are being dug in by Hamas in order to send in militants into Israel who are clearly a terrorist threat to Israel. Within that context, once again, missing are questions such as what are the kinds of repercussions we see within Israel? What are the kinds of effects do we see in Israel? If this is the purported source of violence, what are the effects of this violence that we actually register in Israel? And what are the other kinds of evidence that document the actual use of these tunnels by Hamas to get into Israel, and the kind of harm and the magnitude of harm that is caused by Hamas into Israel?
Let's go a little bit further in this tunnel. I guess the tunnel was built for relatively short people, because if you stand up, you're going to hit your head. I'm not that tall. But you see, it's pretty secure, this concrete. They spent a lot of effort building this tunnel. Hamas boasts about its network of tunnels, posting this video, allegedly showing mass militants entering Israel. Before being targeted by an Israeli airstrike, this video was released by the IDF.
In this particular frame now, we do see the source of the video being articulated as a video that has been posted by Hamas, boasting about its capacity to infiltrate into Israel. And then we have a subsequent video that is posted by IDF that depicts the Hamas militants that have gone into Israel. So once again, the narrative continues to support this broader story of the Hamas threats that are posed to Israel, and therefore this as a terrorist threat needs to be dealt with implicitly through the use of violence and through the use of counter-response.
Hamas never got to use the tunnel I visited. The Israelis found it. They destroyed a big chunk of it back there. They've kept this part. Lieutenant Colonel Azulai believes it took Hamas about 2 years to build this tunnel with concrete and other supplies that he says came from Israel.
We further get into the story, and now we start hearing the perspective of Lieutenant Colonel Azulai, who looks at the concrete and talks about the source of the concrete and discusses how the concrete actually came from Israel. Let's listen to the story further.
You say this concrete came from Israel. How do you know it came from Israel?
We found bags.
The bags. So basically the concrete was provided by Israel to Palestinians in Gaza to build schools, hospitals, stores, apartments, but they used it, what you say, to build this tunnel.
Yes.
So when we come to this particular frame, what becomes apparent is this differentiation between Israel and Hamas. Israel as a humanizing force within this context is the one that is sending in these concrete in order to build hospitals, in order to build schools, and then Hamas has been utilizing these concrete in order to build tunnels and in order to then threaten Israel and its geosecurity. In this particular narrative then, once again, we clearly see the articulation of the benevolent savior that is actually being now threatened by the terrorist threat that is utilizing the benevolence, that is utilizing the benefits that are being sent in order to articulate and construct terrorist goals, and in order to actually create materials and build infrastructures to achieve terrorist outcomes.
Hamas has other tunnels that lead into Egyptian territory used to smuggle weapons and supplies into Gaza.
This is therefore the other part of the story, demonstrating the Hamas tunnels that go into Egypt, through which the weapons and arms supplies are brought in order to support the work that Hamas is doing. So within the broader structure, the narrative works pretty holistically to construct a story of Hamas being the threat to Israel, and depicting then through the maps, through the visuals, the ways in which these tunnels work in order to both draw in arms and then to utilize these arms in order to pose a geosecurity threat to Israel.
But the IDF says the underground passages into Israel have only one purpose. From what you know, what was the purpose of this tunnel?
Attack soldiers. They won't attack regular people, children, women, men.
So they wanted to go in, attack, kill Israelis,
Yes.
but also kidnap Israelis.
Yes.
That was one of the rationales that Israelis have suggested was one of the purposes of these tunnels.
Yes.
The rationale then that Blitzer puts forth is very much the rationale of the IDF, which is that these tunnels are actually being built in by Hamas in order to disrupt Israel and clearly in order to cause harm and geosecurity threats to Israel. In this sense then, the narrative seeks closure by coming back to an IDF and an Israeli story, which is a story that casts Hamas as the threat and therefore the cause behind the intervention. When we look at stories such as these, particularly stories that narrate a story from a specific viewpoint, we have to ask questions such as, what are the sources being brought into the story? What is the relationship of these sources to the frames that are being offered in the story? And what is the role of a journalist within the context of the story? So within the context of this particular story, we do not really see Blitzer asking any critical questions or pushing the legitimacy of the narrative or trying to counter it with any other kind of narrative, but pretty much serving the public relations function of circulating the story, supporting this story, of reproducing this story. When we look at the dominant structures within which the news media tells stories, we have to ask questions such as, what is the relationship of Blitzer to these dominant structures? What is the relationship of CNN to these dominant structures? And what role do these structures play within the broader context of war?